Karoline Leavitt stood quietly in the Crestmore courtroom, just doing her job. Judge Edward Thornton sneered. "This isn't a school project, young lady," dismissing her in front of everyone. No one else was called out, not the slick businessman on trial. Minutes later, that same young woman's evidence led to Thornton's arrest by the U.S. Attorney General. So who really didn't belong in that courtroom? Before we dive into the story, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us hit 1,000 subscribers and keeps us creating stories that matter. Thank you. Karoline Leavitt pushed through the heavy oak doors of the Crestmore courthouse, her navy blazer brushing against the crowd of sharp-suited lawyers. The air smelled of polished wood and old coffee, the kind of place where deals and destinies were quietly sealed. She clutched a worn leather notebook, its edges frayed from years of use, and scanned the packed courtroom for a seat. At 28, she was the White House press secretary, sent to observe a corruption case tied to businessman Robert Mitchell. Her job was to report back, nothing more. But the weight of the room pressed on her chest. She found a spot in the front row, her low heels clicking on the marble floor, and sat, smoothing her skirt, Judge Edward Thornton. A gray-haired man with a hawkish stare loomed from his bench. His black robe seemed to swallow the light, and his reputation for running a tight courtroom preceded him. He shuffled papers, then paused, his eyes landing on Karoline. The room hushed as he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You, young lady," he said, pointing a bony finger. "This isn't a school project. Why are you even here?" Snickers rippled through the spectators. Robert Mitchell, seated at the defense table in a tailored suit, smirked, his gold watch glinting. Karoline's jaw tightened, a flicker of heat rising in her cheeks. But she met Thornton's gaze and gave a polite nod. She opened her notebook, scribbling a quick note, her pen steady despite the sting of his words. She bent to adjust a loose shoelace, the small act grounding her as the laughter faded. Thornton moved on, calling the court to order, his voice booming over the corruption charges against Mitchell's shady real estate deals worth millions. Prosecutor Ellen Harper stood, her briefcase stuffed with files, and began her opening statement. But Thornton cut her off, questioning her evidence's relevance. Karoline watched, her pen pausing. Ellen glanced her way, a flicker of sympathy in her eyes, but said nothing. Turning back to her notes, the room buzzed with whispers, and Karoline felt the weight of being an outsider, her youth a target in a place ruled by experience. As the session broke for a brief recess, Karoline stayed seated, her fingers tracing the notebook's worn cover. She slipped a tiny recorder into her blazer pocket, a habit from her press days. Just in case, a nervous court clerk, Sarah Wells, fumbled with a stack of files nearby, dropping one with a soft thud. Karoline stood, crossing the aisle, and knelt to pick it up. "Here," she said, handing it to Sarah with a small smile. Sarah, her glasses slipping, mumbled thanks, her hands shaking. The gesture went unnoticed by the crowd, who were already filing out for coffee. Karoline returned to her seat, tying her shoelace again, the loose thread a quiet reminder of her father, a small-town lawyer who taught her to stay steady under pressure. The courtroom filled again, and Thornton resumed, his tone sharper as he grilled Ellen's witnesses. Karoline kept writing, her eyes darting to Mitchell, who leaned back, unfazed, whispering to his lawyer, Greg Sullivan. A journalist, Clara Nguyen, sat a few rows back, her pen moving fast, catching every word. Karoline felt Clara's glance but kept her focus on Thornton, whose rulings seemed to tilt toward Mitchell. The session dragged, and Karoline's notebook filled with observations, Thornton's interruptions, Mitchell's confidence, Ellen's frustration. She wasn't here to interfere, but something about the room felt off, like a puzzle missing a piece. As the gavel fell to end the day's proceedings, Karoline stood, her shoelace now secure. Thornton's words still echoed in her head, but she pushed them aside. Slipping her notebook into her bag, Sarah Wells passed by, clutching her files, and gave Karoline a quick nod, a silent thank you. The crowd dispersed, their chatter fading down the hall. Karoline lingered, her hand brushing the recorder in her pocket. That simple gesture, tying her shoelace as Thornton's sneer hung in the air, was a quiet act of defiance. She didn't know it yet, but it would soon unravel his world. Karoline Leavitt slid into a cracked vinyl booth at Millie's Diner, a block from the Crestmore courthouse. The neon sign outside buzzed, casting a faint glow over her navy blazer. Still creased from the day's tension, she ordered a black coffee, now cold in its chipped mug, and opened her worn leather notebook. Tucked inside was a faded photo of her father, Tom Leavitt, his smile warm under a small-town lawyer's tie. She traced the photo's edge, her chest tightening. "I just want to honor you," she whispered, her words lost in the clink of dishes and low hum of late-night chatter. The courtroom's sting lingered Judge Thornton's sneer, the spectators' laughter, Robert Mitchell's smug glance. Karoline sipped her coffee, its bitterness matching her mood. At 28, she'd clawed her way to White House press secretary. But today she felt like an imposter. Her mind flashed to late nights in her DMC apartment, poring over policy briefs, her eyes burning from screen glare. She'd faced doubts before colleagues whispering she was too young for the job. Her boss James Carter's recent warning ringing loudest. "You're too green for cases like this," he'd said last week, threatening a demotion if she overstepped. She'd nodded then. But today's courtroom jab from Thornton hit harder, like a door slamming on her dreams. She flipped a page in her notebook, her pen scratching notes from the trial. Mitchell's corruption case, millions siphoned through shady real estate deals, felt rigged. In court, she'd caught Greg Sullivan, Mitchell's lawyer, muttering to a clerk about keeping the judge happy. The words stuck, a puzzle piece she couldn't place. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Truth doesn't need a loud voice. Tom had fought crooked officials in their small Ohio town, losing cases but never his grit. Karoline wanted that strength, but her hands shook slightly as she set down her mug. A waitress, her name tag reading Bev, refilled Karoline's coffee without asking, her lined face kind but tired. Karoline nodded thanks, her eyes drifting back to the photo. She'd been 16 when Tom died, his heart giving out after a long case against a corrupt mayor. He'd left her his notebook and a belief in doing right, no matter the cost. That belief had carried her through college, through press rooms, to the White House. But now, in Crestmore, she felt small, her youth a weight she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back. A text from James Carter: "Stay in your lane tomorrow. No stunts." She ignored it, her thumb hovering over another contact, listed only as P.B. She typed quickly, "It's worse than we thought." The message sent. Her screen dimmed, reflecting her tired eyes. She didn't know how deep this went, but Sullivan's words and Thornton's bias gnawed at her. She wasn't here to play hero, but she couldn't walk away either. Across the diner, Clara Nguyen, the journalist from court, sat at the counter, her notepad open. She glanced at Karoline, noting her hunched shoulders and the photo in her hand. Clara's pen paused. She'd seen plenty of young aides crash and burn in big cases, but something about Karoline's focus stood out. She didn't approach, just kept writing, her instincts telling her to watch this one closely. Karoline closed her notebook, the photo safe inside. She reached down, tying her loose shoelace, the same one that had tripped her up in court. The act steadied her, a small tether to her father's memory. Bev passed by, dropping a check. "You look like you're carrying the world." "Hon," she said, her voice soft. Karoline managed a smile. Leaving a generous tip, she stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Her heart heavy with duty but firm with resolve, she stepped into the cool night, the diner's glow fading behind her. She didn't know her next step would light a fuse under Crestmore's justice system. Karoline Leavitt stepped back into the Crestmore courtroom, the weight of her navy blazer heavier today. Her worn leather notebook was tucked under her arm, but a small USB drive in her pocket felt like a live wire. The room buzzed with the low hum of anticipation. Lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering. She took a seat in the back row, her low heels silent on the marble floor. Judge Edward Thornton sat high on his bench, his black robe crisp, his eyes scanning the crowd with the same sharp edge that had cut her down yesterday. Robert Mitchell, the defendant, sat at the defense table, his tailored suit pristine, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he nodded to his lawyer, Greg Sullivan. Thornton banged his gavel, calling the session to order. Prosecutor Ellen Harper stood, her face taut, and tried to introduce a witness to testify about Mitchell's shady real estate deals. Thornton cut her off mid-sentence, his voice booming. "This is irrelevant. Ms. Harper, move on." Ellen's hands gripped her notes, her jaw tight. But she complied, her voice quieter now. Karoline watched, her pen scratching in her notebook. Each of Thornton's interruptions a jab at fairness. The sting of his words from yesterday. This isn't a school project burned in her chest. But she kept her face neutral, her eyes flicking to Mitchell, who leaned back, unfazed. During a brief recess, the courtroom emptied slightly, leaving a hum of scattered voices. Karoline stayed seated, her fingers brushing the USB drive. She overheard Greg Sullivan, standing near the clerk's desk, mutter to a young aide, "Just keep the judge happy." And we're golden. The words landed like a stone. Karoline's pulse quickened. She'd suspected a tilt in the case, but this was a thread she could pull. Sarah Wells, the nervous clerk she'd helped yesterday, caught her eye from across the room and shook her head slightly, her glasses glinting. "Stay out of it." Sarah's glance seemed to say. Karoline hesitated, her boss James Carter's warning flashing in her mind. Stay in your lane. But she couldn't. She stood, smoothing her blazer, and crossed the aisle to Ellen, who was reorganizing her files. Her shoulders slumped. "Ms. Harper," Karoline said softly. "This might help." She held out the USB drive, her hand steady despite the knot in her stomach. Ellen looked up, her eyes narrowing at Karoline's youth, her pressed blazer, the notebook clutched like a shield. "What's this?" Ellen asked, her tone wary. "Evidence," Karoline said simply. "Recordings from yesterday, and some financial records on Mitchell." The drive held a snippet of Thornton's biased remarks in court and a paper trail linking Mitchell to offshore accounts, pieced together from her late-night research. Ellen took the drive, her fingers brushing Karoline's, but her face stayed guarded. "I'll look at it," she said, slipping it into her briefcase. Karoline returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She'd crossed a line her job was to observe, not interfere. But the memory of her father, Tom Leavitt, fighting small-town corruption, pushed her forward. He'd taught her to act when the truth was at stake, no matter how small she felt. The courtroom began to refill, the air thick with anticipation. Clara Nguyen, the journalist, sat a few rows ahead, her camera slung around her neck. She glanced at Karoline, noting the quick exchange with Ellen, but assumed it was routine, her pen already moving to other notes. Thornton returned, his gavel striking as he resumed the session. Ellen stood again, her voice firmer now. but she didn't mention the USB yet. Her eyes flicking to Karoline briefly. Karoline leaned forward, her notebook open, her pen still. Spectators murmured, some eyeing her with curiosity, others with dismissal. Mitchell whispered to Sullivan, his smirk intact. Karoline reached down, tying her loose shoelace, the familiar act calming her racing thoughts. Clara's camera clicked softly, catching Karoline's determined look as she straightened up, her eyes fixed on the bench. The session dragged, Thornton's rulings growing sharper, each one tilting the scales toward Mitchell. Karoline's fingers tightened around her notebook, but she stayed silent, trusting Ellen to act. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if everyone sensed a shift but couldn't name it. Karoline's small act handing over that USB had been a quiet defiance, a step she couldn't take back. As the gavel fell to pause the day, Clara's lens lingered on Karoline, her focus sharp. That USB, slipped quietly into Ellen's hand, was about to crack the courtroom wide open. Karoline Leavitt stood frozen in the Crestmore courtroom as Ellen Harper's voice rang out, presenting the USB evidence. The recording crackled through the speakers. Judge Edward Thornton's voice, low and confident, promising Robert Mitchell a smooth trial. The room fell silent, then erupted in murmurs. Thornton's face reddened, his eyes narrowing as he slammed his gavel, the sound sharp against the marble walls. "This is a fabrication," he shouted, pointing at Karoline in the back row. "You, young lady, are tampering with this court. Get out." Spectators turned, some whispering doubts, others staring with curiosity. Robert Mitchell leaned forward, his smirk gone, while his lawyer, Greg Sullivan, scribbled furiously. Karoline's heart pounded, her navy blazer suddenly too tight. She grabbed her worn leather notebook and stood, her low heels clicking as she moved toward the aisle. Ellen Harper, still at the podium, avoided her gaze, her hands clutching the USB like it might burn her. Karoline felt the weight of every eye in the room, some skeptical, some accusing. Clara Nguyen, the journalist, watched from a middle row, her pen pausing as she typed a quick tweet. White House aide Karoline Leavitt accused of faking evidence. Who is she? Karoline didn't see it. She just kept walking, her jaw tight, pushing through the heavy oak doors. In the courthouse hallway, the air was cooler, but the pressure didn't lift. She sank onto a wooden bench, her notebook in her lap, her fingers brushing the pocket where her father's photo rested. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, texts from James Carter, her White House superior. "You've gone too far." One read, "Expect a review when you're back." Another, "You're done if this blows up." Karoline's throat tightened, but she didn't reply. She'd given Ellen the truth, but now it felt like a misstep. Her mind flashed to her father, Tom Leavitt, standing in a small Ohio courtroom, losing a case to a corrupt judge who'd laughed him off. She'd been 12, watching from the back, his defeat a lesson in how truth could falter. The hallway echoed with footsteps, but Karoline barely noticed, her confidence fraying. Social media was already churning, Clara's tweets sparking a wave of posts. Some called Karoline a reckless opportunist, a young aide chasing clout. Others questioned Thornton's outburst, sensing cracks in his authority. Karoline scrolled through her phone, seeing her name trending, her face in a blurry courtroom photo. She shut it off, her fingers trembling. Ellen's hesitation in the courtroom stung. She'd handed her the evidence, but now Ellen seemed to doubt it too. Karoline wondered if she'd misjudged, if her youth had blinded her to the risks. A janitor pushed a mop down the hall, his radio crackling with news of the trial. Karoline leaned back, her shoelace loose again, dangling like a thread of her resolve. She didn't tie it. Not yet. Her father's words echoed. Truth doesn't need a loud voice, but right now, The truth felt heavy, like a stone she couldn't carry alone. She didn't know Sarah Wells, the clerk, had quietly copied the USB before Ellen took it, slipping the duplicate into her desk drawer. Sarah had seen Karoline's kindness yesterday, and that small act had tipped her loyalty. Clara emerged from the courtroom, her camera slung around her neck, and spotted Karoline on the bench. She hesitated, then kept walking, her fingers typing another tweet. Who is Karoline Leavitt, hero or troublemaker? The post went viral, comments flooding in, some defending Karoline, others tearing her down. Karoline, unaware, gripped her notebook, her knuckles white. The hallway felt endless, the bench cold under her. She thought she'd hit rock bottom, her career and her father's legacy slipping away. Then, from the far end of the hall, footsteps echoed slow, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Karoline looked up, her breath catching as a shadow approached. Karoline Leavitt sat on the cold wooden bench in the Crestmore courthouse hallway. Her navy blazer crumpled from the day's weight. Her shoelace dangled loose, untied, as her fingers gripped her worn leather notebook, the edges pressing into her palms. The echo of Judge Edward Thornton's outburst, "Get out," still rang in her ears, and the buzz of her phone, with James Carter's threatening texts, felt like a noose tightening. The hallway's fluorescent lights hummed, casting long shadows on the marble floor. She felt small, her confidence battered by the courtroom's rejection and the viral storm Clara Nguyen's tweets had unleashed, branding her a reckless upstart. A sharp knock from a side door jolted her. The door swung open, and Pam Bondi, the U.S. Attorney General, stepped out, her tailored suit crisp, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark jackets. Karoline's breath caught. Bondi's presence was like a shift in the air, commanding yet calm. "Karoline Leavitt," Bondi said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." Karoline stood, her notebook slipping slightly, her eyes wide. She'd texted Bondi days ago, flagging Thornton's bias, but never expected this. The agents stood back, their faces unreadable, as Bondi gestured to a small office across the hall. Inside, the room was stark bare walls, a metal table, a single window. Bondi sat, motioning Karoline to join her. "Your tips about Thornton," Bondi said. They checked out. "The USB you gave Harper. It's the final piece we needed." Karoline's pulse raced. The USB recordings of Thornton's promises to Robert Mitchell and financial trails had been a gamble, pieced together from her late-night digs into public records. Bondi leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Thornton's been on our radar for months. You just handed us the smoking gun." Karoline's hands tightened around her notebook, her father's photo tucked inside, a quiet anchor. She felt a spark of hope, but also a wave of doubt. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice low. Bondi's expression hardened. "I need you to testify in a closed hearing. Lay out everything, your observations. The recordings, the documents. It'll bury Thornton." She paused, her gaze steady. "But it's not easy. You'll face scrutiny. Maybe lose your job. The public's already tearing into you." Karoline's throat tightened. Clara's tweets flashed in her mind, the online vitriol calling her a fame chaser. Her boss, Carter, would crucify her for this. Clara Nguyen lingered outside the office, her notepad open, catching snippets through the cracked door. She scribbled fast, her instincts screaming this was bigger than a local trial. In the courtroom, Ellen Harper stood near the clerk's desk, clutching the USB, her earlier doubt fading as she replayed the recording in her head. She glanced toward the hallway, her resolve hardening. She'd misjudged Karoline, and now she owed her. Sarah Wells, the clerk, busied herself with files, her own secret copy of the USB safe in her drawer. a quiet act of faith in Karoline's kindness. Karoline stared at Bondi, her mind racing. Testifying meant risking everything: her career, her reputation, the legacy she'd built to honor her father, Tom Leavitt. She thought of him, standing tall in a small Ohio courtroom, fighting corruption despite the odds. His voice echoed. Truth doesn't need a loud voice. She swallowed hard, her fear tempered by duty. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm, nodding to Bondi. The agents exchanged a glance, and Bondi's lips curved slightly. A flicker of respect. Bondi stood, smoothing her suit. "You're not as small as they think," she said, her words landing like a challenge. Karoline rose, her legs steadier now. She reached down, tying her shoelace tightly, the knot a small act of resolve. Clara, still outside, snapped a quick photo through the door's glass, Karoline's determined silhouette framed against the light. Ellen stepped into the hall, spotting Karoline, her expression shifting to quiet admiration. Karoline clutched her notebook, the photo inside grounding her as she followed Bondi toward the office door. That nod to Bondi wasn't just agreement, it was the moment Karoline chose to fight. Karoline Leavitt stepped back into the Crestmore courtroom, her navy blazer straightened, her worn leather notebook clutched tight. The air crackled with tension, the marble walls seeming to close in as spectators packed the benches, their whispers sharp. Judge Edward Thornton loomed on his bench, his black robe stiff, his face a mask of control despite the storm brewing. Ellen Harper stood at the prosecutor's table, her briefcase open, the USB drive Karoline had given her now the center of the room's attention. Robert Mitchell, the defendant, sat rigid, his gold watch dull under the fluorescent lights, while his lawyer, Greg Sullivan, leaned close, his jaw tight. Ellen's voice cut through the hum, firm and unyielding. "Your Honor, based on new evidence, I move for a mistrial." She held up the USB, her hands steady. "This contains recordings of Judge Thornton promising the defendant a favorable outcome, plus documents linking Mr. Mitchell to offshore accounts." The courtroom erupted in gasps, spectators leaning forward. Thornton's gavel slammed, his voice booming. "This is an outrage. That evidence is inadmissible, and I'll dismiss this case if you push it." His eyes darted to Karoline, now seated near the front, her presence a thorn he couldn't ignore. Karoline's pulse raced, her fingers gripping her notebook. She'd been allowed back after Pam Bondi's intervention, but the weight of her choice pressed hard. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another text from James Carter, her White House boss. "Back off now, or you're finished," it read. She glanced at Sarah Wells, the clerk, stationed at her desk, who gave a subtle nod, her glasses catching the light. Sarah's quiet act of copying the USB for Bondi had been a lifeline, a reminder Karoline wasn't alone. But speaking up now meant torching her career, maybe her father's legacy too. Ellen played the recording, Thornton's voice filling the room. "Don't worry, Bob. I'll make this smooth." Mitchell's face paled, his hands clenching. Sullivan stood, objecting loudly. But Ellen pressed on, reading from the financial documents dates, amounts, accounts tied to Mitchell's deals. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, others whispering in shock. Clara Nguyen, the journalist, typed furiously on her phone, her live tweets flashing across screens nationwide. "Crestmore trial implodes. Judge implicated." Karoline watched, her throat dry, knowing every word tightened the noose around her future. Thornton leaned forward, his knuckles white on the gavel. "Ms. Harper, you're out of line. This court will not be derailed by fabrications." His glare fixed on Karoline, a silent warning. She felt the room's eyes, some curious, some hostile. Her father's words echoed, Truth doesn't need a loud voice. She thought of Tom Leavitt, standing in a small Ohio courtroom, fighting a rigged system. She couldn't stay silent. Not now. Karoline stood, her legs steady, her voice clear. Your Honor, I provided that evidence. I've been working with Attorney General Bondi for weeks, documenting your bias and collusion with Mr. Mitchell. The room froze, then exploded in chatter. Thornton's face twisted, his gavel hovering. You're a liar, he spat. But his voice cracked. Mitchell slumped in his chair, his eyes darting to the exit. Sullivan's pen dropped, his objection dying in his throat. Clara's camera clicked, capturing Karoline's calm resolve. Ellen turned, her eyes wide with respect. Sarah Wells adjusted her glasses, a faint smile breaking through. Karoline's heart pounded, but clarity washed over her. She was honoring her father, no matter the cost. The courtroom doors swung open, and Pam Bondi strode in, her suit sharp, 2 federal agents at her side. She nodded to Karoline, signaling the agents to move toward the bench. Spectators stood, phones raised, as Clara's tweets hit a fever pitch, the hashtag Crossfire Justice trending. Thornton's glare burned, but he leaned back, his hands shaking. Karoline's hand rested on her notebook, the photo of her father inside grounding her. Every gaze in the courtroom turned, some with awe, others with dread. She stood tall, her shoelace tied, her voice still echoing in the stunned silence. Karoline Leavitt stood tall in the Crestmore courtroom, her navy blazer creased but her grip on her worn leather notebook unwavering. The air was thick, the crowd's gasps echoing off the marble walls as Pam Bondi's voice cut through Judge Thornton. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice. 2 federal agents moved swiftly, their dark jackets stark against the room's muted tones. Edward Thornton, his black robe askew, stammered, "This is absurd," as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His face, once commanding, now twitched with disbelief, his gavel abandoned on the bench. Spectators surged to their feet, phones raised, capturing the fall of a man who'd ruled this room for decades. Ellen Harper, at the prosecutor's table, seized the moment, her voice steady. Your Honor, based on the USB evidence, I request Robert Mitchell's immediate detention. Mitchell, his tailored suit no longer a shield, slumped in his chair, his gold watch glinting dully. His lawyer, Greg Sullivan, stood, his objection half-formed, but the room's energy drowned him out. Ellen laid out the documents: bank transfers, offshore accounts, Thornton's recorded promises, each word tightening the noose around Mitchell's defense. Karoline watched, her heart pounding, the weight of her small act handing over that USB now reshaping the courtroom. Clara Nguyen, the journalist, typed furiously, her tweets lighting up screens nationwide. Judge Thornton arrested in Crossfire Justice. The hashtag trended, comments flooding in, some cheering, others stunned. Spectators who'd snickered at Karoline days ago now whispered in awe, their eyes darting to her. Sarah Wells, the clerk, sat quietly at her desk, her glasses reflecting the chaos, a faint smile breaking through. Her secret act of copying the USB for Bondi had been a linchpin, sparked by Karoline's kindness over a dropped file. Karoline caught Sarah's eye, a silent thank you passing between them. Bondi stepped to the center, her suit sharp, her voice calm but commanding. This wasn't just about one case, she said, addressing the room. Karoline Leavitt's tips triggered a federal sting to test Crestmore's judicial integrity. Her courage proved this system can be held accountable. The crowd hushed, heads turning to Karoline. She stood firm, her notebook a shield, but her cheeks warmed under the scrutiny. Ellen turned, her earlier doubt gone, and said loudly, "Ms. Leavitt's evidence made this possible. I was wrong to hesitate. The admission hung heavy. A bridge rebuilt in public view. Thornton was led out, his head bowed, his protests fading. Mitchell followed, agents guiding him, his smugness replaced by a tight-lipped scowl. The bench stood empty, a stark symbol of power undone. Karoline's phone buzzed. James Carter, her White House boss, who'd threatened her hours ago, now texting, "Well done." "Call me?" She ignored it, slipping the phone into her pocket. Her focus was here, on the justice unfolding, on the promise she'd kept to her father. Tom Leavitt, whose photo rested in her notebook. The courtroom buzzed, spectators spilling into the aisles, some approaching Karoline with nods of respect. A gray-haired woman, a local teacher, murmured, "You did good, young lady." Karoline managed a small smile, her throat tight. Clara pushed through the crowd, her camera slung around her neck, her notepad ready. "Ms. Leavitt, a word for the Chronicle," she asked, her eyes bright with the story's weight. Karoline hesitated, her fingers brushing her pocket, the photo grounding her. She wasn't here for headlines, but the world was watching now. She knelt briefly, tying her shoelace, the knot tight and sure. A quiet ritual tying her to her father's memory. The room's noise faded as she stood, Clara waiting, the crowd's eyes lingering. She'd toppled a giant, her small steps exposing a rigged system. But as Clara's pen hovered, Karoline sensed her next step would echo even louder. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the Crestmore courthouse, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her. A swarm of reporters surged forward, microphones thrust out, cameras flashing in the late afternoon sun. Her navy blazer, now slightly wrinkled, blended into the chaos, but her shoelace was firmly tied, a small anchor after the storm inside. Clara Nguyen, the journalist, pushed to the front, her notepad ready. "Ms. Leavitt, just a quick word for the Chronicle," she called, her voice cutting through the din. Karoline paused, her worn leather notebook clutched to her chest, and shook her head gently. "Not now, Clara," she said, her tone polite but firm. Sidestepping the crowd, she moved toward the courthouse steps, where a young intern, Lily Tran, struggled with a stack of files, her arms trembling under the weight. Karoline stopped, setting her notebook on a ledge. "Let me help," she said, taking half the stack and neatly aligning them. Lily, her glasses slipping, stammered, "Thank you, ma'am." The act was small, unnoticed by the reporters, but it echoed Karoline's kindness to Sarah Wells days ago, a quiet thread tying her actions together. Lily's eyes lingered on Karoline, a spark of admiration forming. Karoline retrieved her notebook and found a quiet corner near the courthouse entrance. She opened it, her fingers brushing the faded photo of her father, Tom Leavitt, his smile steady under his lawyer's tie. "For you," she whispered, her voice soft. The words, a private vow. The memory of his small-town fights against corruption grounded her, a reminder that her stand against Judge Edward Thornton had honored his legacy. A nearby news van blared a broadcast, showing the empty bench where Thornton once sat, now a stark symbol of accountability flashing across screens nationwide. Pam Bondi emerged from the courthouse, her suit crisp despite the long day. She spotted Karoline and paused, offering a single nod, her eyes hinting at something unspoken, a future role. Perhaps. Though nothing was said, Karoline returned the nod, her throat tight with gratitude. Bondi moved on, disappearing into a waiting car, her agents trailing. The gesture lingered, a quiet promise that Karoline's work wasn't done. Clara's reporting had set social media ablaze, her tweets about Crestmore Justice inspiring stories of others challenging corruption in their own towns, posts flooded in a teacher exposing a rigged school board, A nurse calling out hospital fraud, all sparked by Karoline's stand. Reporters on the steps read the updates aloud, their voices mixing with the hum of the crowd. Karoline overheard a snippet, her name mentioned alongside words like hero and courage. She slipped her notebook into her bag, uncomfortable with the praise. Her focus on the bigger fight she'd ignited. She started down the steps, her low heels clicking, blending into the crowd of onlookers and courthouse staff. Lily Tran watched from the top, clutching her files, her mind turning to law school. Inspired by the woman who'd stopped to help, a street vendor, his cart parked near the curb, called out to Karoline, "Coffee. Miss, on the house, you earned it." He handed her a steaming cup, its warmth a sharp contrast to the cold coffee she'd sipped in Millie's diner days ago. Karoline smiled faintly, accepting it with a quiet, "Thank you." The vendor tipped his cap, his grin wide, unaware of the weight his gesture carried. Karoline walked on, the coffee warming her hands, the courthouse fading behind her. The news screens flickered, the empty bench replayed, voices debating what it meant for Crestmore, for justice. She didn't turn back, her blazer just another shape in the evening bustle. Lily's gaze followed, a seed planted for the next generation. Karoline didn't need the spotlight, her quiet fight had already lit a fire in others. A single shoelace, tied tightly, carried her through a storm no one saw coming. Sometimes, the smallest acts standing up, speaking truth, shift the world in ways no one expects. Not every fight ends in cheers, but the quiet ones leave the deepest marks. What do you hold on to when the room turns against you? If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a question, or even just a pause, subscribe to Crossfire Justice for more stories that echo long after they end. Thank you for watching.